It's an honor to welcome you all to today's conference titled Palestine's Future Amidst the Hamas-Israel Conflict. This event brings us together to explore one of the most urgent and complex issues of our time. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce keynote speaker Dr. Azzam Temimi'yi. Dr. Tamimi is a highly respected scholar, writer, and commentator on the Middle Eastern politics and Islamic thought, with a PhD in political theory from the University of Westminster and a career dedicated to fostering dialogue and understanding. Dr. Tamimi is providing insights into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the dynamics of resistance, and the future of the region. As the chairman and editor-in-chief of Al-Hiwar TV channel, Dr. Tamimi has been at the forefront of shaping conversations around justice, peace, and the struggles of the Palestinian people. We are privileged to have him here today to share his perspectives on Palestine's future amidst ongoing conflict. Dr. Tamimi, welcome. The floor is yours.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa man wala. Would you prefer me to sit down or standing? Or what do you prefer?
Is it preferred?
I can stand, okay. Well, first of all, I'm really delighted and grateful for the invitation, so thank you very much for having me in this most prestigious shrine. When the brothers contacted me about the title of the talk, we had a little bit of a discussion about whether it was a Hamas-Israel war or conflict or what it was about. Actually, this is much bigger. This is a lot bigger than Hamas or than Israel itself. And that's why any talk about the future will have to be based on a proper understanding of the past. What is this conflict about? What triggered it in the first place? And what keeps it going on until today? I remember on the 7th of October, 2023 itself, at least a couple of American writers likened the 7th of October offensive, Tufan al-Aqsa, as it came to be known, or as it was called actually, to what they refer to as the Tet offensive. And I never heard of it, the Tet offensive. I had to go and Google it and look it up and try to learn more about it. And it turned out that the Tet offensive was a major surprise offensive launched by the Viet Cong, the Vietnamese rebels, in collaboration with North Vietnam against southern Vietnamese forces and their American backers. And it was a huge success in the beginning that they took over so many of the villages and the towns in the south of the country. But eventually they were defeated. The Americans came with all the power and really destroyed the invading forces, threw them back and declared victory. Yet, according to both writers, that wasn't really any victory in terms of the future of Vietnam. It was the beginning of the end of American imperialism in that part of the world. And they said, in conclusion, that they can see that the 7th of October offensive can very much also be the beginning of the end of the Zionist project in this area. I mean, imagine to read something like this written by American writers. And the reason for this is that they could see clearly that the occupation of Palestine by Zionism is no more, no less than any previous colonial occupation by any imperialist power in modern history. If you talk about Vietnam, it's similar to Vietnam. If you talk about Algeria and the French colonialism of Algeria, it's like the French colonialism of Algeria. If you talk about apartheid South Africa, this racist entity created there by the white European racists at the expense of the majority of the indigenous population, it's very similar in so many respects. Even if we come closer to our time and talk about Afghanistan. I mean, 20 years the Americans were fighting the Taliban, trying to prevent them from coming back to power. And then eventually the Americans withdrew in humiliation. And people who read history and see the parallels immediately come to the conclusion that inevitably the same thing will happen ultimately. The same thing. Zionism has no future in this part of the world. The problem with many people, including many of those who sympathize with the Palestinian issue, is that their understanding of the problem is not complete. There's something wrong about the way they understand the issue. This is not about a Palestinian state missing and the need to have a state for the Palestinians. Actually, Palestine was never a state in its history. There was never a Palestinian state there. Why? Because Palestine was always part of the Ummah. Since it was taken over by the Muslims from the Byzantines, and of course the people of Palestine, my own ancestors at the time, who were Christian, were victims of a Byzantine invasion. That's what it was. The Arabs or the Muslims who came from Arabia came as liberators. Since that time, with the exception of the brief period in history when the Crusaders invaded Palestine and established their Crusader kingdoms, Palestine was always part of a much bigger entity. And the last of these political entities was the Ottoman Empire or the Ottoman Caliphate. So it's not about a state. It's not even about a humanitarian situation, although of course there is a humanitarian catastrophe there. But it's not about that. It's not about feeding the Palestinians or clothing them or sheltering them until you slaughter more of them, and it's just a continuous process. It is about our ummah as a whole, the Muslim ummah, not the Arab ummah, the Muslim ummah being invaded and threatened by the imperialist powers of the West. Well, originally, the issue of Palestine started in Europe. The problem of Palestine has a lot to do with a European chronic problem. What was that chronic problem? It was the Jewish problem. Europe had a problem with the Jews. They didn't like them, they hated them. The term anti-Semitism is European in its origins. It's not Arab, it's not Turkish, it's not Ottoman, it's not Muslim, because we, the Muslims, never had a problem with the Jews. Jews are the people of the book, Ahlul Kitab, they are Ahlul Dhimma. They lived with us for centuries, no problem whatsoever. Yet, in Europe, and despite the fact that they lived there for centuries, they were continuously being persecuted, oppressed, and accused of murdering, of having murdered Jesus Christ. So there was a Jewish problem for the Christian Europeans. But in addition, there was a new element that goes all the way back to the 16th century, and that's with the birth of the Protestant sect. That revival of Christianity in the form of an evangelical missionary creed redefined the position of the Jews in the kingdom of God. And the position of the Jews was to be prepared to go back to the promised land in order to pave the way for the coming of the Messiah. And this is the root of Zionism. This is the origin of Zionism. Actually, Zionism was not Jewish in its origins. It was Christian. And that's why the biggest camp that supports Israel in the world today is the Christian Zionist camp, not the Jewish Zionist camp. Actually, there are more Jews probably increasingly today who are opposed to Zionism and to Israel than Christians. Because as Grace Halsell once noted in her writings about this, she was a great woman, she wrote several books about Christian Zionism and its influence in America and in the world. She estimated that 60% of Protestant Americans who went to church were Zionists. The other factor that came in later on was the collapse of the Islamic political order, the destruction of the Ottoman Empire, and the partitioning of its former territories and the creation of new entities in the form of territorial states. They call them nation states, but actually they are not nation states in any form. They call them nation states to follow the example of what happened in Europe, but actually they are only territorial states because they're all one nation. From Morocco from the Atlantic to the Gulf, they're all Arabs, speaking Arabic, same tribes. If you search for my own tribe, the Tamimis, you'll find them in the land of Arabia, you'll find them in Palestine, you'll find them in Tunis, you'll find them in Egypt, you'll find them everywhere. Probably you'll find them here too. I don't know. I mean, both of my grandparents were born here in Istanbul in the old days. It was one huge entity, and people moved about and around in that huge empire, and we were part of it. That came to an end. It was destroyed. It was partitioned, and the colonial powers of the time, whose rulers at the time, especially in Britain, happened to be Christian Zionists, decided to implant an entity in the very heart of these lands, the Muslim lands, to become a Jewish homeland. Actually, the founders of the Zionist movement, modern founders of the Jewish Zionist movement, what they refer to in literature as political Zionism usually, namely Theodor Herzl and his comrades, preferred to have a Jewish homeland in Argentina. They thought that Palestine was troublesome. You cannot touch it with the Ottomans in place, and how are you going to fight an entire Muslim ummah? That was the idea. But it was the Russian delegates to the Basel Conference in 1897 who insisted that in order to market this project, in order to convince other Jews around the world that this project was worth supporting, it had to be in Palestine. It couldn't be anywhere else. Though Theodor Herzl tells us in his memoirs that he even tried for Cyprus. He tried for Libya, because Libya was an Italian colony. There was the East Africa project, Mozambique, etc. So, you see, who decided eventually, and who made it possible for Israel to be created in Palestine? Not Theodor Herzl. He died in 1994, a long time before, 1904. He died in 1904, long before the project materialized, but it was the victors in the First World War who decided so. And there was, of course, there were a series of things, a series of important events. Some repealed their predecessors, but it doesn't really matter. From the Hussein McMahon correspondence in 1915 to Sykes-Picot in 1916 to the Balfour Declaration in 1917 to San Remo to all sorts of conferences. These were planning things for other nations. They were having pencils and rulers and drawing lines and dividing. Who? Dividing our ummah. You see, the idea was that this was a golden opportunity to make sure that the Ottomans would never come back, that the Muslims would never come back, that the Islamic Ummah would never revive itself. This was the idea. It's not about the Dome of the Rock or Al-Aqsa, although of course they are very dear to us and they are very important and they motivate us, etc. It's about something which is much bigger. It's about our Ummah as carriers of a mission from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is what the war is about. This is what the conflict really is about. And that's why it's not about Gaza. It's not about Hamas. It's not about the West Bank. Suppose they finish everybody in Gaza. Suppose they banish everybody in the West Bank. Do they think it's the end? Of course it's not the end. Palestine was once liberated by a Kurdish man, Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, who came all the way from his home province, and Muslims were coming from everywhere, and that's why in Palestine you find people from the Maghreb, Al-Maghariba as they are called, you find people from Kurdistan, Al-Kurd, they are known. Everybody came with Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi. He mobilized Muslim masses from everywhere. This is the issue of the Ummah as a whole. Not only that, usually in colonial projects, you end up with one of three scenarios. First scenario is the one that happened in America, in Australia, in New Zealand, and similar places, where the indigenous population is finished off. You just finish everybody off, you annihilate them, complete genocide, there's nobody to struggle for the rights of the descendants. The second, and then the invaders become the new nation and they establish their own civilization. They have their own flag, and they have their own narrative, etc. And then the second scenario is the eventual defeat of the colonizers. And we saw this in Algeria, as I told you earlier. We saw this in Vietnam, we saw this in South Africa, we saw this in many Latin American countries, in various parts of Africa and Asia. Eventually, people who struggle for their freedom win their freedom. And the third scenario is for some sort of a stalemate to be reached. And here, the two parties enter into some sort of a compromise, some sort of an arrangement that gradually puts an end to the conflict or the struggle. And this is the model of South Africa. Because in South Africa, neither group finished the other. And this wasn't likely to become an objective in itself. Yet when the white minority regime got tired and when there was a global anti-apartheid movement growing up everywhere, the rulers of the apartheid regime went to Nelson Mandela in his prison cell in Robben Island and said to him, Nelson, come on, we want to finish this off. How can we bring this to an end? And he said, very simple, no more apartheid, we can live together. And actually there was a moment in the history of Palestine when this was possible. Hamas itself, as I explained in my book, offered this. The long-term truce, on the basis of which we paved the way for some form of a peaceful coexistence when rights are restored. Yet, the Zionist project has proven that it is incapable of the first, incapable of the second, and incapable of the third. All three scenarios at the moment, as we stand, the Zionists, despite the massive power they have, they are incapable of achieving. Another thing from history that we need to be aware of is that there is no struggle for liberation that ends up with success without enormous sacrifices. Famously, Algeria is referred to as the 1 million martyr country because they keep telling us that they offered 1 million people in their struggle. And actually, I discovered from discussions with some Algerian friends that this was in the very last, probably, year of the struggle. But since the revolution started around 10 years earlier, 15 million Algerians were killed by the French. That's the figure they gave me. See, in Vietnam, how many millions do you think perished in Vietnam? How many people perished in Afghanistan in order for Afghanistan to kick the Americans out? There is no freedom without sacrifices. And I think most Palestinians understand this. They understand this very well. Actually, when we were kids, our parents taught us this. We carried the message forward and taught our children, and we are teaching our grandchildren as well, that in order for our country to be liberated, in order for us to be free again, we have to make sacrifices. You cannot just stay in the masjid, in the mosque, and just make dua and think that the world will change for you. Okay, dua is good, prayer is fard, we have to perform it, but also jihad and making sacrifices is a fard. You cannot just leave it for somebody else. You have to do it. And this is what actually the formula has already been stated in the Quran. إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِقَوْمٍ حَتَّى يُغَيِّرُوا مَا بِأَنفُسِهِمْ. Allah does not change the state of a people until they change what's wrong with themselves. So you need to start looking inwards and see, okay, what's wrong with you? I remember, we Palestinians, there was a time when I was a young child that we had very little to do with our deen, our Islam, our true identity. Many of us were westernized. Our families, I was a young child at the time. Arab nationalism invaded us. We became so nationalist that it blinded us And nationalism invariably leads to blindness, because you cannot see the truth with such an ideology. Only when we started looking inwards and changing that what was wrong with us, that things improved for us. Although you see today the people of Gaza being massacred, the children, the women, the men, the destruction, yes, it's horrible, it's painful, it breaks our hearts, but this is a sign that the people are making a change. That you are really defying a world order that is failing humanity. And this takes me to the final point. I don't want to take much longer of your time. Takes me to the final point, that what Gaza is doing to the world, and what the steadfastness and the struggle of the Palestinians and the perseverance of the Palestinians is doing to the world. I think we are going to lead the movement for changing the world order. This world order that was born out of the Second World War, so oppressive, so unjust, so inhumane, so hypocritical, that it applies double standards as a rule to everything, now it is being questioned. And it is being questioned by the children and the grandchildren of those who have been guarding that world order. On campuses in America, campuses across Europe, in Britain, in France, and elsewhere, young students, male and female, many of them are Jewish, children of Jewish families. Probably their parents were staunch supporters of Zionism, are now questioning this world order and distancing themselves from Zionism. And this reminds me of the global anti-apartheid movement that started nearly in the early 70s. I was a young student in Britain at the time, and I remember that fellow students from the National Union of Students in Britain were having a continuous sit-in Trafalgar Square in the heart of London in front of the South African embassy. And that was a burgeoning movement, global movement, that eventually brought pressure to bear on the supporters of apartheid. Do you think apartheid existed because the white minority in South Africa were so powerful? It existed and continued to exist because Margaret Thatcher supported it, Ronald Reagan supported it. They considered people like Nelson Mandela to be terrorists, just like they talk about Hamas today. People who are describing Hamas as terrorists today are the ones who described Nelson Mandela a terrorist in the old days. Margaret Thatcher famously said, Nelson Mandela is a terrorist who would never be allowed to set foot on British soil. And eventually he came, he was honored, and they have even a statue for him in the center of London today. I think we are seeing a beginning of change, and that change is definitely, partly at least, credited to the alternative new media that has broken the monopoly maintained by the mainstream media for so many decades, where they manipulated facts, where they decided what the public should know or should not know. Today, every one of you can be a reporter. Every person in Gaza or in Al-Khalil or in Nablus or in Jenin or in Lebanon with a smart mobile and a connection to the internet can become more informative and even more influential than the New York Times, which has been lying and lying and lying all along. So see, there are changes in the world, and I would encourage you as young men and women, students and studying for your degrees, always look at the bigger picture. Don't be captivated or bogged down by the small details of the crisis. Come out of the crisis and look at the bigger picture. The bigger picture is very promising. We are seeing the beginning of a major change in world affairs, and Gaza is leading this. I think I better stop here and probably allow time for discussions if you wish, of course.
I had a question regarding protests. How effective do you think the protests around the whole globe are? How important are they to the Palestinian people or the Palestinian cause?
They are very effective and they are necessary, and we need to maintain them, and we need to encourage them, and we need to increase them. From two sides. First, they send a signal to the powers to be, to governments in Washington, in London, in Paris, and elsewhere, that there is at least a sizable segment of the population that is unhappy with what they're doing. It's important. You have to express your unhappiness, your displeasure with the crimes that are being committed against humanity. But at the same time, they give another signal to the Palestinians that the Palestinians are not alone. I remember I used to be a major speaker in earlier wars in Gaza, in London, in the demonstrations. And in the war that took place in December 2008, January 2009, I received a phone call from the Minister of Health in Gaza, a friend of mine, and who said to me, I want you to deliver a message to the people you address next time you have a demonstration. Tell them, keep demonstrating, because when we see you in the streets of London, we know we are not alone. We know our struggle is worth continuing. So it lifts the morale of the victims of oppression. And I can tell you something. These young men and women on campus around the world are instilling fear in the hearts of decision makers. I mean, these young men and women in their early 20s, who will they be in 10 years' time? They will be the decision makers. They will be in the foreign ministry, in the defense ministry, they will be in trade, they will be in commerce, they will be here, they will be there, they will be in the industry. They will be making policies very soon. And that's why some of the traditionalist decision makers are really horrified that this signals a major shift in public opinion. Now, if democracy was truly working in the democratic world, probably all these policies would have changed, because according to polls conducted at the street level, the majority of people across Europe support the Palestinians, not the Israelis. Yet, the majority of policies are adopted in favor of the Israelis. Such discrepancy is a testimony that democracy is failing. It's not really representing the people. And that's why there is so much anger among these young generations who are demonstrating. Those who are today demonstrating in support of Gaza and in sympathy with the Palestinians, they're actually protesting against a hypocritical world order that needs to be changed. Please.
Can you interpret the Halep liberation in the context of Palestine?
What liberation?
Aleppo.
Aleppo, it is still ambiguous. Some aspects of what's going on in Aleppo today is still ambiguous. Yet, from my discussions with some of our brothers here in Istanbul, Syrians and Palestinians who are connected with Syria, what seems to have happened is that many Hezbollah units who were stationed in northern Syria were withdrawn because Hezbollah needed them in Lebanon. And when that withdrawal happened, these armed groups started mobilizing and preparing themselves. And as they marched on, the Syrian troops collapsed. And some of them even compared it to the 7th of October in Gaza. That when Hamas entered into southern Palestine, they didn't find Israeli troops. They had already been withdrawn, something similar. But it's a different story. It's not directly connected to what was going on in Palestine, because the Syrian people have a problem. The Syrian people have been oppressed, persecuted, killed, and banished by this dictatorship. And they've been struggling. They lost the last round, but they have not given up. So whenever they have an opportunity, they will rise up again. And I think this represents another round in their struggle for freedom. Now, what's likely to happen now, it's really difficult to tell. Even analysts specialized in Syrian affairs are divided about this. How likely is Russia to come back and get involved as it was involved before? This is still a question because of the war in Ukraine. Iran itself is not in a very good shape. It's not as strong as it used to be. And the Iraqis have denied this morning, today, they denied that they were sending any militias or any armed men into Syria. And that's an important change in the dynamic. Yet at the same time, the Americans and the Israelis are worried because a change of regime in Syria that they are not prepared for might not be a very pleasant development. If you remember, well, maybe some of you won't remember, you were still young at the time. 14 years ago when the Arab Spring started, initially many countries supported the Arab Spring, but eventually the Americans intervened and set the rules because they were afraid that collapse of the Assad regime in Damascus would be a threat to Israel because they were not sure about the alternative. So the Americans ordered the Europeans, and I know from my own personal experience that during the first year, the British and the French supported the Syrian revolution. But from the second year onwards, they stood against it in line with the American stand. I think what happened in North Syria a few days ago has taken so many people by surprise. I've tried myself really to understand whether the Americans had a role. I couldn't find any clear indications. Whether the Turks, the Turkish government here had a role. The information I have received is that they were very reluctant initially to support such a move, but then eventually they just let it happen. I think it is mainly motivated by so much anger and pain among the Syrian people themselves.
I think it is very much related to Iran proxies.
Of course.
So if the Iran is going to lose the proxies, what would be? That would be the.
Well, Iran has proven to be an utter failure, really, in protecting its proxies. I mean, look what happened to Hezbollah. Hezbollah was a formidable force. And look at the scandal of the pagers and the talkie-walkies. I heard, I listened actually to a discussion on Sky News in London. They had an expert from Chatham House who said they had information that the guy who brokered the pagers and the walkie-talkies deal was an Iranian. So actually it came from the Iranian. That's such a failure. And remember what happened to Ismail Haniyeh, a security failure, a major security failure, that he is assassinated when he is the state guest. So I think, it seems to me that the Iranians are losing it.
There is also another perspective. So Iranian and Hezbollah security has been very much weakened because of the Syrian war, because there are also very much intelligence cooperation with Russians, Syrians,
True.
that caused the security issue for both Iran and Hezbollah.
Indeed, you are right. And I read a report that says that the security breach started actually with the entry into Syria.
Yeah.
When they came into Syria and they started working with Syrian regime officials, and that was the beginning of the breach of security.
Yeah.
They were infiltrated, easily infiltrated.
Yeah.
Terrible.
There
It
are
was
also sleepers.
It was a terrible decision on the part of Hezbollah. I mean, my friends at Hamas told me that in the beginning, Hezbollah was not in favor of going into Syria and standing by the Syrian regime. They and Hamas together had the opinion that Assad should make some political reforms and avert what happened in Tunisia, in Egypt, etc., or in Libya. But the Iranians pressured Hezbollah, and that's a terrible thing. It's a truly proxy. If you are a proxy, you have no independence. You cannot make your own decisions. And that's the difference between, and that's why within Hamas there's been so much argument about where do we stand when it comes to Iran. Because Hamas traditionally, and I discussed this in depth in my book, traditionally Hamas kept its independence. Yes, they took support from the Iranians, but they told the Iranians, we don't allow you to intervene up to a certain level. Yet when Khalid Mish'al was replaced by Haniya, there was a slight change of attitude toward Iran. And that created heated discussion within the movement. Yet Hamas continued to maintain its independence. So Hamas cannot be called a proxy, although in the media it's called a proxy. But in case of Hezbollah, in case of the Houthis, in case of the militias in Iraq and Syria, I regret to say that they receive orders from Tehran.
Dr. Tamimi, my question would be very much historical and conceptual about the Palestinian movement against Israel, because you, from the beginning, your perspective is that Palestinian is a part of Ummah, and Palestine has never ever been a state. So that's why the Palestinian cause is a Ummah cause.
Yeah.
But if we listen this speech on Palestinian cause in 1960s, it was the Arabian struggle, let's say the Arabian movement against Israel, because it was identified as an Arab-Israel war.
That is true.
And then in 1970s it was merely Palestinian-Israel war, because PLO was so strong and there was also strong Palestinian nationalist movements. So the Palestinian movement also identified Islam as the nationalist movement against Zionism and Israel. But today you are more or less right, because it is the part of the Ummah right now, or the consciousness of the Palestinian movement very much strong among the all Ummah all over the world.
Yes.
So is it also contemporary concept, or it has always been the cause for the Ummah?
It's actually restoring it to what it should be. Because if you go back to the first Jerusalem conference on Palestine in the 30s, where scholars came from various parts of the world, it was an Islamic cause.
Yeah.
Then with the rise of Arab nationalism, it was downgraded to an Arab cause. Then with the PLO created by the Arab League in 1964 to tell the Palestinians, okay, it's your own cause, take it and do with it whatever you like, it's none of our business. It became a Palestinian cause. But I think the new generation of Palestinians are enlightened enough to understand that progress, it wasn't always progress actually, it was regress in much of it. And now we are seeking to restore it to its original identity. But also facts on the ground are supporting this. I mean, look, Zionism is not just a threat to the Muslims. Zionism is proving to be a threat to humanity. And this is what an increasing number of people are discovering around the world. Even if you follow the account of Naturi Karta, they call themselves the Torah Jews. They consider Zionism to be a threat to Judaism, to the Jews. So the world perspective is changing because of what Zionism is doing to the world. And for us, for people like myself, it is our responsibility, it's our duty to correct concepts and to cleanse the discourse and to come up with a factual narrative about what we are struggling for. Please.
I have a question about in domestic separation in Palestine. For example, we know that Mahmoud Abbas on power officially, but the last election was in 2005, and after approximately 20 years there were no election occurred. And as a protest in Gaza, Hamas declared its governance in Gaza, and they are ruling since 2007. My question is about Mahmoud Abbas is considered as an authoritarian ruler. It doesn't allow free and fair elections, and that is why we don't see fully rational and good ones for Palestinian cause. Good ones for Palestinian cause doesn't rise in political sphere in Palestine, like Yasser Arafat, it is being claimed. So, is it right? Do you buy this argument? My question is that.
By the way, Palestinians have always been divided. Since the beginning of the Zionist project. And that's because of the existence of different perceptions of what is going on around them. If you have a certain perception, then you act upon it. You form your own theory and you adopt your own strategy. Originally, the Fatah movement came out of the womb of the Muslim Brotherhood. So the founders of the Fatah movement initially were Ikhwan, were Muslim brothers actually. But later on, because of the geopolitics and because of pressure from Arab nationalism and from the Nasser regime in Egypt, they had to shed away their Islamic identity and become increasingly Arab nationalists and more pragmatic until 1974 when the Fatah movement came up with the so-called 10-point declaration, which was read as a readiness to recognize the State of Israel. From then onwards, the divergence became a lot clearer. There's one line that is willing to recognize Israel in exchange for a Palestinian state anywhere of any size, and another that maintains that Israel has no right to exist in our homes and in our lands. Until Hamas came to represent, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, to be fair, because Islamic Jihad preceded Hamas, came to represent that authentic rule or line. Now Mahmoud Abbas is a completely different person. He is very much like a camellia. You know the camellia, the lizard? I don't know what it is called in Turkish, but in Arabic it's al-hirba. Araf al-hirba? Camellia. It's like a lizard that changes color. Here it becomes gray, here it becomes white. It's a lizard that changes color. He's a very strange phenomenon. And now he changed from a very anti-Zionist, because his PhD in Moscow was anti-Zionist, anti-Jewish even, anti-Semitic, to being a Zion lover, because that means his continued existence. But in the process, this national liberation movement became so corrupt, became so bankrupt at the same time, that it really doesn't enjoy much support among the Palestinians, except in terms of the people it employs, because there's a sizable portion of Palestinians who get paid by it as employees in the West Bank in particular. Eventually, it doesn't really matter what Mahmoud Abbas thinks or what he doesn't think. What really matters is that there is a clarity of vision among the majority of the Palestinians. that irrespective of who is installed in Ramallah or who is installed in Gaza, our struggle will not end until Palestine and the whole of Palestine is once again free.
So, Dr. Tamimi, you end your speech about like hypocrisy in the European countries, specifically on the Western democracy. Can you speak a bit the hypocrisy in the Arab world as well? Because just before the 7th of October, there was also Abraham Accords, and there were some like construction plans, the railway construction between Israel, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia, and there were lots of projects. So as you mentioned, there are two lines in the Palestinian movements. One doesn't accept Israel as a state, and another one says, okay, Israel might be a state, but two-state solution still might be a part of the solution. So, what is the situation for the Arabs? So, most of the Arab being, let's say, the leading politician figures are like the Western also decision makers, but the people are totally against Israel. So what is the hypocrisy, and what is the situation for the Arabic world as well?
And this is what Mohammed bin Salman told Friedman the other day, when he said to him that if you think I care about Palestine, I don't care about Palestine, but my people care.
Yeah.
He said that. And of course the root problem here is that these Arab states are ruled by governments that don't represent the people. When the Arabs rose and wanted to change the situation and have a democracy, we had a counter-revolution, which was a partnership even with Israel itself. We used to have a lot of hypocrisy among governments, but now it's no more. It's no longer hypocrisy. It's exposed. It's Zionism today. Many Arab governments actually are Zionists. They adopt the exact narrative as Netanyahu and as Ben Gvir and Smotrich, rulers like the rulers of the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Morocco, and prior to that Egypt and Jordan. They don't believe that Israel can ever be defeated or should even be resisted. They prefer to enter into business with Israel and have this collaborative relationship that brings them more fortunes and more profits. And had it not been for the 7th of October, Saudi Arabia was going to join the Abraham Accords. Just 24 hours earlier, they were preparing for that. So I don't call these rulers hypocrites. I call them Zionists. They belong to the same camp. And they are the ones who joined hands with Israel in order to topple Mohammed Morsi in Egypt and destroy the Arab revolutions.
And also the Palestinians are the victim of the Arabian countries as well. They don't have any rights in Lebanon or the...
Yeah, with different, of course in Lebanon the situation is very bad. But the way I see it, the Palestinians are not the only victims of this situation. All the Arabs are victims. I mean everywhere. I mean today you have 60,000 political prisoners in Egypt. You have about 35,000 prisoners in Saudi Arabia. It's a miserable situation. So we are not the only victims. The entire population of this land that extends from the Atlantic to the Gulf are victims of these gangs, these thieves, corrupt elite that are directly linked to the colonial powers. Yes, sister.
We talk about our perception that it's a Ummah issue for us. But for the Israelis, is it still a religious issue for them too?
This has changed with the passage of time. Initially, for the Zionists, the founding fathers of Zionism were actually secular and they were atheists. They didn't believe in God. There's a brilliant book about this that's worth checking. It's called The Myths of Zionism by someone called John Rose. Rose, you know the Rose, R-O-S-E, John Rose. He was a staunch Zionist, and then he converted to becoming a very a strong supporter of Palestine. And in which he explains that the founding fathers of Zionism were all atheists, didn't believe in God, yet they used the Bible to convince other Jews that the Zionist movement was legitimate. Yet with the passage of time, especially after 1967, when Israel occupied more land and started this massive settlement movement, they created a new creed, which is today called religious Zionism. It's a contradiction in terms, because Zionism is supposed to be secular, but today we have a different movement called religious Zionism, which justifies Zionism in the name of religion. And the use of religion to justify crimes against humanity is not something new. There's an excellent book about this by someone called Michael Pryor, P-R-I-O-R, Michael Pryor. The title is The Bible and Colonialism, in which he explains that throughout the history of colonialism, the Bible was always used by colonial authorities to justify the invasion of other people's countries and plundering them and dispossessing them, etc. Religion is very powerful. It's powerful on the side of truth, and it's powerful on the side of falsehood. It depends on how people use it. And we saw even among the Muslims a very bad example of how Islam was used on the side of falsehood with ISIS. ISIS was a terrible example of the use of Islam in order to justify crimes against humanity. So it can be used by anybody, and the Zionists, in the tradition of the Christians themselves, use the Bible to justify their crimes against humanity.
So is it the main cause of them invading the Palestine?
Is it what?
Is it the main cause of them?
The main reason, you mean? The main reason for occupying Palestine? No, the original reason for occupying Palestine has nothing to do with religion. It had to do with European developments and Middle Eastern developments. The creation of a new Middle East at the time when Europe wanted to export its own problems elsewhere. So it was political, economic, and social in the beginning. But these alone are not enough. You have to have a big dose of religion injected into it in order to give it legitimacy. You want to ask? Yeah, go ahead.
I wonder what's your and Palestinian people's stance on the perception, the stance of Turkey on this issue, and the acts of the Turkish government.
Mixed views you will find, depend on who you are talking to. Usually when we judge other people's positions, it depends on how much knowledge you have about the background of their decisions, of their arguments. Of course, there was a time when President Erdogan was the hero of not only the Palestinians, the hero of the Arabs and the Muslims. Yet since the coup attempt in 2016, was it? And because of, and also post Khashoggi affair, when Turkey needed to open up to the Arab world, mend relations with Saudi Arabia, mend relations with Egypt, and with the UAE, even with Israel, perceptions started changing a little bit. But if we strike comparisons, of course, Turkey's position is a lot more advanced compared to most Arab positions. So some people make these, some people compare Turkey with others. Some people compare Turkey today with Turkey a few years ago. But if you want to be fair, you need also to compare Turkey today with Turkey 30 years ago, when the situation was completely different. I remember the first time I visited Turkey was almost 32 years ago, in 1992. and I don't recognize that Turkey anymore. It's completely different. So we've really come a long way. People like me who know Turkey, who understand the politics behind the scene, can understand why certain positions are taken at certain times. But the ordinary public, they don't see it this way. It depends on immediately what they hear and what Turkey does. Turkey has suffered a little bit because of the continued supply of certain essential goods to Israel while the war was going on. But then later on, we heard that they severed ties and they decided to stop. But even when Erdogan was speaking the other day at the forum, some young men and women were angry with him, and it can happen. But I mean, to conclude answering your question, Turkey is as much a victim of the Arab regimes as the Arab peoples. Because if Turkey had better Arab governments, Turkey could do a lot more. But unfortunately, all the Arab governments are Zionist governments, most of them, not all of them. Probably the only government that is supportive, more sympathetic, is that of Qatar. And Qatar and Turkey are on some good terms, but also Turkey needs Saudi Arabia, they need the Emirates. They need to bypass the Turkish, the Greek, Egyptian axis, and that's why they need to improve relations with Egypt. And all of this is done at a price. Nothing is free of charge in politics.
So if there are no other questions, before we conclude, we had a small gift.
Thank you very much.